of Orthodox spirituality.
Lord, have mercy, Lord, have mercy.
A wondrous journey into Orthodoxy.
Lord, have mercy.
Prepared and presented by Angeliki Antonakou, Lekea.
God is the Lord, and hath appeared unto us. Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord.
Hello, dear listeners. We are continuing to read from the book Spiritual Awakening, the second volume in the series Spiritual Counsels by Saint Paisios. The mark of spiritual sincerity is love. The world is in a sorry state nowadays because everyone is saying great truths which do not correspond with reality. Sweet words and great truths have value when they come from truthful mouths, and they produce results on the well-intentioned and those who have a pure mind. Yeroda, is there a worldly sincerity and a spiritual sincerity? Yes, of course. Worldly sincerity contains indiscretion. Does this mean that someone speaks in season, out of season? Not only that, truth is truth. But if at some point you speak the truth without discernment, this is not truth. For example, it is true that so-and-so is mentally disturbed. But if you go and tell this truth, you do not benefit anyone. Or another person says, in order to be sincere, I am going to sin in the public square. This is not sincerity. Anyone who has a great degree of discernment also has noble love, sacrifice, and humility, and he speaks even the bitterest truth with great simplicity, sweetened with kindness. The benefits reaped are greater than those of sweet words, as bitter medicines do greater good than sweet syrups. Truth, when used without discernment, can be criminal. Some people act in the name of truth and commit crimes. When someone has sincerity without discernment, he can do double harm, first to himself and then to others, because this sincerity is without compassion. Whoever wants to be truly sincere should start by being sincere with himself, for that's where spiritual sincerity begins. When someone is not sincere with himself, he's at least only fooling and wronging himself. But when he behaves without sincerity towards others, he sins mortally because he fools others. Yeroda, is it possible for someone to act this way out of simplicity? What simplicity? Where did you ever find simplicity in such a person? If he is a child, he'll have simplicity. If he is a saint, he'll have simplicity. If he is an adult and is not mentally retarded, but behaves in this manner, he must be a devil. And how does he feel? He feels like hell itself, one temptation after another, endless temptations. Yeroda, is no one then to behave forthrightly? Forthrightness, as many understand and use it, has a legalistic spirit. I am forthright, they say. I proclaim upon the housetops. Compare Luke 12, verse 3. And proceed to ridicule the other person, but they end up ridiculing themselves. The letter of the law kills. Compare 2 Corinthians 3, verse 6. Once I asked someone, what are you, a fighter for Christ or a fighter for temptation? You know that there are fighters for temptation, don't you? A Christian must not be a fanatic, but have love for everyone. Whoever hurls indiscreet words, even when he may be in the right, does harm. I once met an author who was devout, and yet spoke to worldly people in a brutally frank way that was nonetheless profound, and was thus able to shake them out of their complacency. Once he told me, "In a gathering I said this and that to a lady," but by the manner in which he had made his remarks, he had crippled the poor woman. He embarrassed her in front of everybody. "Look," I told him, "you are hurling golden crowns with diamonds at people, but the way you're throwing them, you are hurting heads, not just sensitive ones, but hard ones too. Let us not throw stones at people, Christian style. Whoever censures publicly someone who has sinned, or whoever speaks with animosity about someone, such a person is not motivated by the Spirit of God. He is moved by another spirit. The way of the Church is love. It differs from the way of the legalists. The Church sees everything with loving forbearance and seeks to help each person, no matter what he has done or how sinful he may be. I notice in some devout people a rather strange type of logic. Their devotion and good intentions are all very well, but they also need to be spiritually discerning and broad-minded, so their devotion is not accompanied by narrow-mindedness or hard-headedness, that is a stubborn and closed mind. The premise is to be in a spiritual state, to have spiritual discernment. Otherwise, one remains at the level of the letter of the law, and the letter of the law kills. He who has humility never takes on the air of an instructor. He listens, and when asked of his opinion, he speaks humbly. He never says "I," but rather, "My thought tells me," or "the Fathers tell us." He speaks like a student. Anyone who thinks that he can correct others thinks far too highly of himself. Yeroda, when someone sets out with good intentions to do something, only to go to extremes, does he lack discernment? Pride has infiltrated his activity, but he does not realize it because he does not know himself yet, and that's why he goes to extremes. People often start out piously but get lost. This is what happened during the iconoclast controversy between the iconodules and the iconoclasts. Extremes on one side, extremes on the other. The iconodules went as far as to scrape the paint off the icon of Christ and put it into the chalice to improve Holy Communion. The iconoclasts would either burn the icons or throw them away. This is why the Church was forced to place the icons high up, and once the controversy subsided, the icons were lowered for the people to venerate them and to render honor to the persons they represented.
And do thou behold my body's grievous infirmity, and heal thou the cause of my soul's sorrow.
Whatever we do, we must do for God. Yeroda, usually I am motivated by fear of hurting other people's feelings or of lowering myself in their eyes. I don't think about disappointing God. How can I increase my fear of God? We need to be vigilant. Whatever we do, we must do for God. We forget God, and then the thought that we are doing something important enters our mind. We become overly concerned with being liked by others, and then we worry about not lowering ourselves in other people's eyes. Instead, if we proceed with the thought that God sees us, that He is observing us, then what we do is sure. Otherwise, if we do something in order to appear good to others, then everything is lost. Every effort is wasted. For every action of his, man must ask himself, what I am doing pleases me, but does it also please God? and must examine whether it is pleasing to God. If we forget to do this, then we also forget God. That's why in the old days they used to say, "For God's sake," or "Oh, that godless man, he has no fear of God." Or else people would say, "God willing," or "If God permits it." People felt the presence of God everywhere. They kept God constantly before them, and they were careful. They actually lived what the psalm says, "I have set the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand, I shall not be moved." Psalm 16, verse 8. And they did not waver or move away from God. Now you see, the European way of life is gradually entering our society, and many people are well behaved out of a worldly sense of good manners. Whatever we do, we must do purely for Christ, keeping in mind that Christ sees us and is observing us. Christ must be at the center of our every action. The human element must not get in the way. If we act out of a need to be liked by others, this does not benefit us at all. We need to be very careful. I have to always examine the motives for my action, and as soon as I detect that I am motivated by a need to be liked by others, then I must strike it down at once. For when I try to do good, but my need to be liked by others gets in the way, this is like drawing water from the well with a sieve for a bucket. Most temptations are often created by ourselves, when we include the self in any cooperation with others. That is, when we are motivated by self-interest and want to elevate ourselves and seek our personal gratification. One rises to heaven through spiritual descent, not through worldly ascent. Whoever walks lowly always walks securely and never falls. This is why we should uproot as far as we can the worldly concern to project ourselves and achieve worldly success, which leads to spiritual failure. We should reject hidden and obvious egoism and the superficial need to be liked by others, so we can come to love Christ most sincerely. Our time is not characterized by what is discreet and noiseless, but by what is impressive yet empty. The spiritual life, however, is discreet and noiseless. It is good to do what is well within our means, quietly, without ambitious displays beyond our capabilities, because otherwise it will be at the expense of our soul and body, and often at a high cost to the Church as well. By truly pleasing our neighbor, we also please Christ. It is here that we must be very careful to purify our agreeableness towards our neighbor, to eliminate the need to please others, and to allow this human offering also to go to Christ. When someone is attempting to base ecclesiastical issues upon supposedly orthodox models, but his aim is simply to position himself more favorably, to seek his own self-interest, how can he ever be blessed by God? As much as possible, he must try to conform to the will of God. He must always examine himself and see how he can perform the will of God. When he performs the will of God, then he is related to God, and then, without even asking for it from God, he receives endless living water from the source.
And our relief in distresses, O maiden, and in thy light do we ever exalt with joy. O Lady, do thou also now from all passions and perils deliver us.
Let us acquire a spiritual sense. The Holy Spirit is one, but has many gifts. It does not vary from place to place. The Holy Spirit is not a spirit of confusion. It is one of love, peace. When spiritual men attack one another, this means that they are under the influence of many other spirits which have no relation to the one Holy Spirit. In the past, the Holy Spirit illumined, guided. It was a matter of utmost importance. Today, the conditions for the Holy Spirit to descend do not exist. The Babylonia of the Old Testament was innocent. You'd ask for clay, and they would bring straw. Now we have a Babylonia with passions. You ask for clay, and they throw a brick at your head. But if someone can eliminate the self from his every activity and curtail his own will, then he can work properly and certainly have the divine enlightenment to create a spirit of understanding. For when we put aside the idea we have of ourself, the divine ideas come. One must acquire a spiritual sense in order to have divine enlightenment. This work is crucial in order for people to understand a few things, especially in our times. This is imposed upon us by the circumstances. You see, even back in Asia Minor during those difficult years, conditions forced people to think more. 2 Greeks could communicate between themselves in front of Armenians and Turks without the latter understanding anything. There's even more reason for us today, given the conditions we're living under, to have spiritual people who are able to communicate with each other. Difficult years are ahead. Our mind must be in gear. If our mind isn't in gear and there is no divine enlightenment, then in each case one must receive a directive on how to act. Do not expect to be told everything. Some things you must come to understand on your own without being told. I remember once in Konitsa, before I went to the army, we heard that guerrillas were coming to town. There were 4 of us. The 3 were Muslims, and we hid in a Turkish home at the edge of town. A little Turkish boy, 5 years old he was, understood the situation and told us, "Go cook room, I go out." So we went into the kitchen and came out behind the house in time to hide in some storehouse further down. The boy went out and told the guerrillas there was no one in the house, and they went away. A little boy this high, who barely knew how to speak, was able to think and act so wisely. Now he was sharp. You see, he observed the situation and he had love, whereas an adult could have done harm by being careless and thoughtless. We who have received baptism and chrismation, we who have been instructed in the faith and have studied the faith, must not be stunted in a state of spiritual immaturity. Be sharp-witted, Xefteria. Do you know what Xefteria are? They are the 6-winged cherubim, Exapteriga, who have 6 sets of wings, and who flap them as they sing, "Holy, holy, holy, go fly with 6 sets of wings." Divine enlightenment is everything. I often tell people, arrange matters as God enlightens you. When I say, as God enlightens you, I mean that man must view things with divine enlightenment and not through human rationality. One must not think that whatever makes one feel comfortable is also the enlightenment of God. How does enlightenment come to us? If we burnish the wires, the sinful man can become a good conductor, and then the grace of God will be transmitted to provide the divine light of grace. Otherwise, the system is short-circuited, and grace cannot enter. The basic thing is for man to take care not to lose the grace of God, so as to have divine enlightenment. For everything is in vain if there is no divine enlightenment. What difficulties Christ had with his earthly disciples until they were overshadowed by divine grace. Before Pentecost, authority was given to the disciples to help the people. But they did not yet have the divine enlightenment which they received at Pentecost. When Christ told his disciples that he was going to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man was going to be crucified and raised, and so forth, they imagined that when he arrived in Jerusalem, the people would raise him up to be king. They were thinking in human terms. This is why they were concerned as to who would sit at the right side or the left side of Christ. The mother of the sons of Zebedee went to Jesus and asked that he place one of her sons at his right and the other at his left. Compare Matthew 20, verses 17 to 21. But from the day of Pentecost, when Christ sent the Paraclete, the Holy Spirit, the apostles received divine grace forever. Prior to that, they had divine enlightenment only on occasion. It was like their batteries were charged but would run down again. They needed to be plugged into an electrical outlet and be recharged. Again and again they would run out. Again and again they needed to be recharged. When the Paraclete was sent to the apostles, they no longer needed to be recharged. It's not that we are now better and they were worse, but rather that we are now living in the time of grace. And this means that we have no excuses. We are baptized. We have the Holy Spirit through chrismation. We have it all. Back then, Christ had not yet been crucified, and in a way, the devil still had some authority and could easily mislead the people. Following the crucifixion, Christ granted to all the ability to receive divine enlightenment. Christ sacrificed himself and liberated us. We are now baptized in his name. The electrical outlet is now permanently in place. Now it is we who are interrupting the passage of divine grace, and this is because we let the wires get rusty. Yaroda, what is required for the Holy Spirit to dwell in man? A fighting spirit, humility, philotimo, nobility, and sacrifice are some of the requirements. Man is worthless without the grace of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is the light, the divine light. The whole basis is there. If someone cannot see, he may walk into a window, walk off a cliff, or into a ditch. He cannot see where he is going because he lacks the necessary light. If he sees even more clearly, he can avoid all the dangers and walk safely on his way. And for light to come, one must be willing to come out of the darkness. Even if people see poorly, they will not fall, and God will not be displeased. If a father is troubled and worried over his children falling into mud, into thorny bushes, or off a cliff, imagine how much even more God himself is troubled over us. All the evil in the world exists where divine enlightenment is lacking. And when divine enlightenment is lacking, man is in darkness. Then one person says, "Let's go this way," and the other person says, "No, I know better. This is the way we must go." And so it goes, this way, no, that way. Each person thinks it is better to go his way. In other words, they are all interested in going the right way, but they are all in a sort of confusion and cannot come to a mutual understanding. If there were no confusion, they would not be arguing. They would have recognized the best way and would take that direction. I mean to say that everyone may have a good disposition, but given the confusion, many problems are created in society and in the church. At least in the church, most people do not have a bad disposition, but they do lack divine enlightenment. They struggle for the good, but where do they end up? For this reason, we must ask God to grant us even a little divine enlightenment. Otherwise, we will constantly stumble as if we were blind. In the Divine Liturgy, when the priest says, "We offer to you your own from your own," I pray to God that He provide light for the people to see. A small ray of light provided by God can dispel the darkness, keep the people from spiritually crippling themselves in the darkness. During the reading of the second psalm, which Saint Arsenios of Cappadocia read as a prayer to God to enlighten those going to conferences, I pray. May God enlighten all the leaders of the world, enlighten all the hierarchs and fathers of the Church to receive the Holy Spirit, so as to be able to help the people of the world. Even if a single one is enlightened and others become at least receptive, can you imagine what great good could be achieved? One timely word spoken by a leader can make a big difference. People have a need for divine enlightenment. The benevolent God provides His divine enlightenment to those who have good intentions. A judge once related a case which he had encountered personally. A monk was sent by his monastery with 500 gold coins to buy a field. He went to ask a real estate broker, who said to him, "Leave the gold coins with me so you don't have to carry them." So he left the money with the broker. What a nice man, the monk thought innocently in his heart. He relieved me of that burden. When the monk returned, the broker not only did not give him back the coins, but even claimed that he had given the monk 8 million drachmas. The poor monk thought how he would return to the monastery. Not only had he given the 500 coins and received nothing in return, but the broker was demanding an additional 8 million drachmas. The matter ended up in court. At the trial, the judge had the inspiration to ask a series of questions whose answers not only proved that the broker had not given anything to the monk, but that he had also taken the gold coins. I was able to see that the judge was in a spiritual state similar to that of the prophet Daniel. See Daniel, Susanna, verses 45 to 62. As he had the fear of God in his heart, God illuminated him to act appropriately and uphold justice. The whole basis is divine enlightenment. When divine enlightenment comes, then not only are the person and his environment at peace and at ease, but he himself can continue to make spiritual progress. This is why I keep saying that while the lights and the chandeliers, these impressive discoveries of the mind, are nice and useful, the divine light of the grace of God, which enlightens man, is superior. The person who has divine enlightenment can see things very clearly. He is well informed without doubts and can positively help others without becoming weary.
Failed me, no one cared for my soul.
I cried unto thee, O Lord, I said, Thou art my refuge and my portion in the land of the living.
Dear listeners, our show has come to an end. Thank you for listening. We will continue once again where we left off in our next show. Until then, be well.
Stronger than I.
Bring my soul out of prison, that I may praise thy name.
The righteous shall...
Lord, have mercy, Lord, have mercy. Lord, have
Readings of Orthodox Spirituality.
Lord, have mercy, Lord, have mercy.
A wondrous journey into Orthodoxy.
Lord, have mercy.
Prepared and presented by Angeliki Antonakou, Lekea.